So I want to ask basically three questions. What does the designation of David and Adam as Khalifa mean in the Quran? How is it related to the Quranic conceptualization of believing rulers and its understanding of salvation history? And how does this possibly relate to the political discourses related to the Roman-Persian War at the beginning of the 7th century? I have divided this paper in four parts. At first, I will quickly refer to what Heribert Busse has coined as Herrschertypen in the Quran. In the second part, I will sum up the Hiseto interpretations and problems of interpretations of the Quranic usage of the term Khalifa and its plural forms, as well as other relevant derivations from the same roots. In the third part, I will sum up the concept of vicarious kingship in Syriac political theology, and finally give a suggestion how this discourse can help us to understand the Quranic depiction of Adam and David as Khalifa. So in his article, Herrschertypen im Koran, Heribert Busse conceptualizes the Quranic understanding of kingdom and rulership. He analyzes political figures in the Quran and describes typological similarities between them. Typology is defined by him by referring to Rudolf Bultmann and his suggestion that repetition and a cyclical view of history are essential for typology. And according to Busse, Quranic prophetology is repetitive, and its view of salvation history could also be understood as cyclical. He then systemizes certain types of rulers in the Quran, and he believes that the Sitz im Leben of this political theology of the Quran was Muhammad's own political role and the political behavior of his adversaries. The following table shows the different types of rulers in the Quran classified by Busse. Prophet kings are those figures in the Quran who explicitly or implicitly combine the role of being a prophet and a king. And Busse argues that they share typological similarities. For example, their devotion to God, their wisdom, their role as judges, as architects, and so on. And the second important category for Busse are so-called God kings. For example, Pharaoh declares himself to God and claims to have godly powers. And in comparison to prophet kings, the God kings are unjust, defiant, and so on. In my book, The Quran in seinem Religions- und weltgeschichtlichen Kontext, I've argued that the typological similarities between believing rulers are also intertextual. What I mean is that the Quran is adapting characteristics of political figures such as Alexander the Great in texts of, for example, the Syriac Alexander legend to describe believing rulers in general. And I'm arguing that Quranic theology is related to religious, political, and apocalyptical discourses connected with the Byzantine war propaganda during the Roman-Persian War, and thereby denies certain conceptions such as a davidic Messiah, an end-time ruler, and an end-time war. Now, in the second part of this presentation, I want to look closer at both Quranic verses which apply the term Khalifa. In Surah Al-Baqarah, it is said, and I'm quoting the verse, "And recall when your Lord said to the angels, I am going to put a Khalifa in the earth. They said, will you put in it someone who will wreak mischief in it and will shed blood while we glorify you with praise and declare you holy? He said, I know what you do not know." And in Surah Sa'd, David is also qualified as Khalifa, and I'm quoting the verse, "O David, we have made you a Khalifa in the land. Judge between the people in truth. Do not follow caprice, lest it leads you away from the way of God. Those who stray from the way of God will have a severe punishment for having forgotten about the day of reckoning." If we check the Quranic usage of the derivatives of the root Khalafa, then we get the following overview. The singular Khalifa is attested only 2 times in the quoted verses, And in 7 instances, the plural forms khalif, khulafa are used. And 5 times each, the verbs khalafa and istakhlafa are attested in the Quran. Now, if we ignore the singular form khalifa, then it becomes clear that in the other cases, we can convincingly presuppose the meanings and connotations of succession, replacement, substitution, and even in one case, to be the deputy or temporary replacement of someone. And this fits well with the Quranic topos that God replaces believing humans with believers, that believers succeed unbelieving people, and that they inherit the land, in some cases, of their unbelieving adversaries. I also want to shortly refer to the early exegetical understandings of the term Khalifa. Wadad al-Qadi, in his article, The Term Khalifa in Early Exegetical Literature, identified 3 main interpretations. Firstly, the understanding of Khalifa as someone who succeeds, follows, comes after another. Secondly, the understanding of Khalifa as someone who replaces another person, substitutes him, or also is a deputy for a temporary supposed manner. And thirdly, simply to govern or to rule or to be king. Now, regarding the understanding of Adam as Khalifa, Nikolai Sinai has stressed an important observation. And I'm quoting him from his introduction to the Quran. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30, employs the term Khalifa at the same point in the narrative at which the biblical version describes Adam as God's image and likeness, namely in the context of a divine announcement prior to man's creation. This functional equivalence, however, hardly entitles us to take the Quranic term Khalifa to convey the same meaning as the corresponding biblical phrase. Rather, Surah 2, verse 30 draws on a notion that recurs more widely in the Quranic corpus, the idea that God will annihilate a disobedient people and replace them with another, thereby making these letters the former's successors. Whereas earlier Quranic retellings of the creation of man simply omit the biblical notion of Adam's likeness to God. Surah 2, verse 30 substitutes it by formulation that links the creation of Adam to a core aspect of the Quran's general theology of history. Also, an important piece of evidence to understand the Quranic usage of Khalifa could be old South Arabian inscriptions. Most recently, Solomon Dost has referred to an inscription of Abraha, where the cognate form to Khalifa is applied by Abraha for his governors. And thus suggests that possibly the Quran transforms this political understanding of being a governor into a religious concept. So we could understand Adam being the Khalifa of God in the sense that humans are the vice regents on earth. In one instance, the verb khalafa is applied in the Quran in a similar sense as in the old South Arabian attestation. In Surah 7, verse 142, Moses seems to make Aaron his deputy for the time of his absence with certain duties. And I quote the verse, "And when we made an appointment of 30 nights for Moses and rounded them off with 10, and the full period of his Lord was 40 nights, and Moses said to his brother Aaron, 'Be my deputy among the people, set matters right, and do not follow the way of those who do mischief.'" Now, so this was a really short summary of of important aspects of the interpretative problems to understand the Quranic notion of Khalifa. Now I want to jump on the third part of my presentation. Also in the third part, I want to consider the concept of vicarious kingship in Syriac political theology to understand the term Khalifa in the Quran. Manolis Papousakis did a great and excellent study of this concept, and at the end of his book proposes the following task, and I'm quoting him: "It should be left to specialists in Quranic studies to decide whether the concept of vicarious kingship as formulated by Ephraim with reference to David, and elaborated upon Jacob of Zerug with reference to Adam, may in any way contribute to an understanding of the term Khalifa, where in Surah Al-Baqarah we have the reference to Adam, and in Surah Sa'd the reference to David. And in this part I would like to make a first attempt to elaborate on a possible parallel here. But let me first summarize some of the key results of the study of Pappus Hackett before doing so. So for all Syriac authors who reflect on the concept of vicarious kingship, the blessing of Judah in the book of Genesis is very important, and this was also Dr. Bomazdov referred to. And I'm quoting the whole 3 relevant verses, but the last verse is especially important, and it is said then in this benediction, Judah, it is you your brothers will praise. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. The sons of your father will bow down before you. Judah is the whelp of the lion. From murder, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down and crouched like a lion, and like the whelp of the lion, and who will rouse him up? The scepter will not depart. And this is the beginning of the 10th verse, and this is the important one. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the expositor from between his feet, until there comes he to whom it belongs. It is him the peoples will expect. Yeah, so especially this 10th verse about the promise of a dynasty of Judaic rulers until the coming of a messianic, possibly messianic figure, is now important for the further argumentation. Because the scepter was understood as the symbol of sovereignty and kingship, and also there are expanded versions of this verse in the Peshitta, where this last part, until there comes to he to whom it is rendered as Malkusa, so his kingdom. Now, while referring to these verses, Afrahat introduces the concept of keeper of the kingdom, Natar Malkusa, in his demonstrations, and argues for the invincibility of the Constantinian Empire against a Sasanian assault, because they need to remain till Christ the King, Malka Mashiach, will come back so that they can give him the scepter. Now I'm quoting where he elaborates on this point. Hence the one vineyard replaced the other, and in his first coming he handed the kingdom this time over to the Romans, who were called the children of Esau. And these children of Esau keep the kingdom, Natre Malkuta. For the one who gives it and the keeper of the kingdom is going to become subject to him, to whom all is going to be subject. Because of this reason, this kingdom of the children of Esau is not going to be delivered into the hands of the Persian forces, which have been gathered, intending to go up against it, because it is for the one who gives it that the kingdom is kept. Yeah, so, and the children of Esau that are now the Constantinids. Now, Ephraim, in his commentary to the book of Genesis, further develops this concept of Natar Malkusa. He comments, and again referring to the benediction of Judah, indeed, although the passage from Judah it is you, your brothers will praise, and includes the scepter and the expositor will not depart, should be understood with reference to Judah and to the kingship of David and the sons of David, who descended from Judah. The passage, however, which begins from until there comes he to whom it belongs, and so on, should be understood with reference to the Son of God in truth, and not by means with reference to David and the sons of David, who descended from Judah. Moreover, by his utterance, until there comes he to whom it belongs, most clearly indicated that all those who preceded him were vicarious kings, that it's men who were handing down the crown which had not been theirs. So let us systemize these thoughts of Ephraim. So Ephraim adapts this concept of Natal Malkusa and develops it further as Natal Duksa, which Papusakis convincingly says should be translated as vicarious king. These are kings in the Davidic lineage, and it is important for Ephraim to differentiate between these vicarious kings who will keep the kingship and scepter, and Christ the Messiah, whom this kingdom will be given finally, and they will hand it over to him. For Ephraim, this differentiation between vicarious kings and Christ the king corresponds to the difference between the promised land to Abraham and the heavenly Jerusalem, or to the difference between the likeness of something and the reality of something. And the Constantinids are also, for Ephraim, the representatives of the vicarious kings in the lineage of the Natal Duksa of the Davidic line. Literally, Natal Duksa means place keeper. And it's a calque on the Greek term topoteretes, which renders the Latin vicarious. Now, let us go a step further in the reception. In his homily on Tamar, Jacob of Saruk applies the concept of vicarious kings also to Adam. And I'm quoting the verse, when your compassionate father fashioned Adam in his image, it was you he formed in him, so that in you the lowly dust which was elevated to the state of majesty might be adorned. When he created him, it was your likeness he gave Adam, that he might put it on, so that in it he might reign over all created things and make them his own. When he made him, it was by an act of breathing that he anointed him, so that he might be a vicarious king in the world until you come. So, for Jacob, Adam is also vicarious king, and he links this role of Adam to his creation in the likeness of God. And an important parallel to this understanding of representation would have been the vicarious function of imperial images in the Roman period. Now, it is interesting how it is possible to harmonize this understanding of vicarious kingship of Adam and David from a diachronic perspective. The cognate Syriac root to the Arabic root Khalifa seems to play an important role in this regard. It has the basic meaning of to change, substitute, and replace, but not to succeed. And Syriac authors use derivatives from this root to describe how, for example, Adam was replaced by Noah, or Saul was replaced by David. So, in his homily on David and Goliath, Jacob argues that Saul is the second Adam because he resembles him in his failure, although he has failed God in his task. And I'm quoting his argumentation. Now Saul was painted in Adam's colors with precision. The one was a weakling and the other a brazen man, showing contempt for his Lord. Indeed, Saul was second Adam. Adam moved out of that garden, for he had committed sin there. Saul, the weakling, was removed from the kingly office, for while occupying it, he had committed wrong. Adam came to possess a place of toil so that he might be tormented in it. Saul, the weakling, was possessed by an evil spirit by which he was consumed. Adam was the first man, the head of all families, the king of all races, exactly as Saul himself was the first of the people's kings. And now look at how then they explicitly describe this replacement of one person with other persons. For example, Ephraim argues that Saul was replaced by David. And I'm quoting again from the demonstrations. David was anointed by Samuel in order to become king in the place of Saul, who had sinned. And Jacob of Saruk further points out that Noah replaced Adam. And I'm quoting also from an homily. And if God had stricken according as he also regretted that he made Adam, Noah the remnant would not have been left behind to resettle the earth. Righteous Noah became the one who made a new beginning, the second Adam. And another important quote, also from Jacob of Saruk, Noah separated the sacrifices and fed the altar with whole burnt offerings. He became, in his generation, a sapling, and here we have Khalifa, for the world which had vanished. So in this last quote, Jacob uses the Syriac cognate to Khalifa to describe the role of Noah as sapling for the world. Now, so if you look at this evidence, I would like now finally to give some suggestions how the described discourses, as we learned, ambivalent term, in the tradition of Syriac political theology could be helpful to understand the Quranic depiction of Adam and David as Khalifa. A first comparison leads to the following results. There seems to be an important parallel between Adam and David, described as vicarious kings in Syriac political theology, and the Quranic designation of Adam and David as Khalifa, which could be and was interpreted as denoting them as wise regions. Further, it is quite interesting that while Jacob of Saruk is explaining the role of Adam as vicarious king by referring to him as being created in the image of God, the Quran seems to replace the concept of Adam's likeness of God with the term Khalifa. And thirdly, the cognate roots of Khalifa in Syriac and Arabic at least share the meaning of replacing or substituting, but not to succeed. Now, let me formulate some assumptions on how the Quran is reacting to Syriac political theology. My first point is that the Quran denies that believers replace or substitute each other. Secondly, I believe that the Quran denies the promise of an eternal Davidic dynasty and the conception of a messianic figure in the end time. Thirdly, the Quran denies the conception of worldly rulers who are vicarious kings appointed by God to represent him. And an important Quranic strategy seems to be that it applies verbs and nouns from the root khalafa to negate and mitigate the concept of vicarious kingship and replacement of believing rulers, since it has the connotations of succession and replacement. So we should look now at the Quranic evidence for my suggestions. God never says explicitly in the Quran that his chosen people or someone of his chosen people and believers were replaced by other believers, later believers. Believers succeeded each other, and unbelievers are replaced by new people. And being Khalifa or Khalif or Khulafa does not mean that those persons and people were immune to then later on failing God. For example, the following verses from the 10th surah make clear that God replaces unbelievers by new people and that they also can possibly fail God. I'm quoting the verse. In the past, we have destroyed generations before you when they did wrong, and their messengers came to them with the clear proofs, but they would not believe. Thus we recompense the people who sin. Then we appointed you as successors in the land after them, that we might see how you act. And also in this regard, it is worth mentioning the verses 33 and 34 of Surah Al-Imran. And I first quote the relevant verses. And it is said that God chose Adam and Noah and the family of Abraham and the family of Imran above all created beings, the seed of one another. So the Quran is not saying here that Noah replaced Adam or later on the family of Imran replaces the family of Abraham. They were all chosen, and they constitute also genealogical lineages, why it is said that they were zuriya of one another. Interestingly, a very prominent family from the biblical perspective is missing here when it comes to the chosen people and the constitution of seeds or lineages, namely the family of David, the Al Daud, who are explicitly named in the Quran, but are never said to be chosen. I believe that the Quran is reluctant to accept David for initiating a chosen lineage of kings. That is why he is called Khalifa. This becomes clear when we analyze how in the Quran David is following Saul as a king. In Surah Al-Baqarah, the election of Saul as king is described and how David followed in his footsteps. And I want to quote the whole passage. It's a long passage, but it's important to understand the whole narrative. So, their prophet, so Samuel, said to them, God has raised Saul as a king for you. They said, how can he have sovereignty over us when we have a better right to it than him, since he has not been given any abundance of possessions? He said, God has chosen him over you and has given him a generous increase of knowledge and of strength. God gives his sovereignty to those whom he wishes. God is embracing and knowing. Their prophet said to them, the sign of his sovereignty is the ark in which there is an assurance from your Lord. Will come to you and a remnant of what which the family of Moses and Aaron left behind, born by the angels. In that there is a sign for you if you are believers. When they went forth against Goliath and his host, they said, our Lord, pour out on us steadfastness, make firm our feet, and give us help against the people who do not believe. By God's permission, they routed him, and David killed Goliath. And God gave him sovereignty and wisdom and taught him some of what he wills. So, yeah. I will wait till the bells will have finished. So we are in Paderborn, and now everyone. Yeah? Oh, good. Okay. Then I will. Okay. Then. So when compared directly to the biblical account, it is interesting that in the Quran, David is not following Saul as a failed king and does not replace him. Also, it is not explicitly said that David was the one who brought back the ark, but it is the sound of Saul's sovereignty and a promise to Saul that it will be brought back. And most importantly, it is Saul and not David who is explicitly said to be chosen in the Quran. So unlike the Syriac authors who would argue that David replaced Saul as a failed king, the Quran is describing that David simply followed Saul, who was a chosen king. Thus, this becomes even more evident when we look back to Ephraim in his commentary on Genesis, where he reflects on the blessing of Judah and introduces the concept of vicarious kings. And I will again, this is a lengthy quote, but it's important to quote it to understand the discourse. So, again, Ephraim argues, he wrote, the scepter will not depart. That is the king, nor the expositor, who is the prophet that expounds the future until there comes he. Not David, whom kingship made great, but Jesus, the son of David, who is the Lord of kingship. The king and the prophet will not depart from the house of Judah until there comes he to whom kingship belongs. And now this is important for us. Otherwise, they should demonstrate to me that there were kings before David who were succeeding one another in the tribe of Judah and who were keeping the crown for David. If now there was no king before David, it is manifest that it was through David himself, as well as through the sons of David, that kingship was being handed down and kept for the son and Lord of David, who is the Lord of kingship. So Ephraim argues that David did not follow kings before him, who handed down the scepter to him so that it could be later on given finally to Christ the King. The Quran questions and inverses this reasoning and explicitly describes how David followed, in fact, a king before him who was chosen. So this is a case of what I've called counter-factual intertextuality. From the perspective of the Quran, it is clear that the lineage of David and his kingship ended with Solomon's death. This could be deduced from the way the Quran describes his death in Surah 34. And I quote again the verse, "And when we decreed that he, Solomon, should die, nothing showed them that he was dead, but the creator of the earth eating away his staff. And when he fell, the jinn saw clearly that if they had known the invisible, they would not have remained in humiliating toil." So the Quran is describing that after Solomon died, his staff or rod was eaten by an animal. The Arabic word used here for the staff is minsa'a, which is a hapax legomenon in the Quran. And one cannot underestimate the symbolism of this staff. In the blessing of the tribe of Judah, the staff or the scepter was interpreted as the symbol of the sovereignty and kingship of the Davidic kings. And it is remarkable that the Quran is now describing that this staff is eaten by an animal, so that after the death of Solomon, it cannot be handed down anymore. This corresponds to the fact that in the Quran, Solomon asks God for the greatest kingdom, but not, as in the biblical account after building the temple, for an eternal dynasty of kings. With the death of Solomon, the lineage of Davidic king ends. Now, can we apply this proposed interpretation of David as a successor also to Adam, being Khalifa? I believe we can. When compared to the biblical account, it is probably no coincidence that the Quran entitles Adam as Khalifa, where one would expect him to be described as created in the image of God. Since Jacob is justifying the role of Adam as vicarious king by him being created in the image of God, it is possible that the Quran is countering this type of reasoning by introducing the concept of Khalifa. And from the Quranic narrative itself, it makes sense that Adam followed the angels, if you follow the logic of the story told. In other instances, the Quran is even arguing that angels could have been successors among men. So let me conclude my paper by reflecting on why this proposed Quranic engagement with ideas from the tradition of Syriac political theology would have been relevant at the beginning of the 7th century and in the context of the Roman-Persian War. Syriac political theology and its conceptualization of salvation history were important, possibly, to interpret the events of the war itself. For example, and this is what also Dr. Boumazdev has referred to, the Syriac Alexander legend presupposes that Alexander, or the Roman ruler, is a vicarious king who will give his throne ultimately to Christ the king. From the perspective of the political theology of the Quran, there are no believing rulers who represent God's kingship on earth and fight for him till the end time when his son will come as Christ the king. This could be the reason why the Quranic depiction of Adam and David as Khalifa disregards their interpretation as vicarious kings. Thank you very much.